welcome to this second day of the Tocqueville Center's final event of this fall term. Can you believe it? We're nearing the end. If you don't know me, my name is Brent Nelson. I'm the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society, and I'm also a professor in the Politics and International Affairs Department. If you were with us last night, and I do see a number of second timers, which is really, really good. We love it when people come more than once. You heard last night that Elizabeth Huga and Gary Marx were talking about the radical right parties in Europe and the possible effects of the right parties on the European Union and certain scenarios that might come out of that. Tonight, we're going to broaden the picture a little bit, and we're going to have Professor Matthias Matthijs look at transatlantic relations. In short, the Transatlantic Trump Trap. And I can't wait to find out what that means. But I kind of thought, I was thinking about this today, I kind of thought Alexis de Tocqueville himself would have loved to be on the response panel after these talks. Don't you think? Okay, so he was early 19th century, but he had a deep interest in both what was going on in America and the implications it would have for Europe. And so I have a feeling that he would have been pretty good on the panel. Now, his English wasn't awesome. He learned it in 6 weeks on the boat from France to the United States. How many of us can, learn a language in 6 weeks and then, interview people in that language? So he was a little rough at the beginning, but, by the time he got a few months in, he was much better. So we might have to be patient with his accent, but I think he would be pretty good. So we'll start seances next term, but no. So we're about the big questions in the Tocqueville Center. We like to ask questions like, what does it mean to be human? And what does the good society look like? And how do we govern ourselves without destroying the possibility of human flourishing? And if you're interested in those kinds of things, we have groups for you. The Tocqueville Fellows are kind of the group that really helps us put on all of these things, and you have to apply to get in the spring. So next term, if you want to be a Tocqueville Fellow, look for those applications. But we also have the Beaumont Fellows, which is another group of students who don't quite want to be as involved in all the things that we do, but want to enjoy discussions and think about these things, maybe read a few texts. And anybody can join that. So if you want to be a Beaumont Fellow, just come and talk to me, or look for somebody who has a little Beaumont name tag on, and they will be glad to tell you about that. I don't want to neglect that there are Attlee people here too, and Attlee has started a Tocqueville special interest group. And so if you're interested in being a more mature student and joining us for lots of our conversations, we're going to have one tomorrow between the Attlee SIG and Beaumont. Join us. We'll have a good time. We can't wait for that. So once in a while we go beyond the big questions, we go deeper, because sometimes it's good to have some data when you're trying to think about the big questions. And so we heard a lot about what was going on, public opinion, and party positions and things like that yesterday, and that was very helpful. As we think about the big questions, we have to know what's actually going on. So we sometimes like to focus a little bit more on the details. So tonight we're going to hear from Professor Matthijs, and then we're going to welcome to our stage our two speakers from last night, and also Professor Marion Strobel from our own history department for the response panel, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And I promise that tonight we'll have more audience Q&A than we had last night. We ran into time. It was a great night, but I will try to let you all ask some of your questions. If you want to look at the full bios of our speakers, please avail yourself of our brochures. All of the details are in there. But I would like to introduce to you Matthias Matthijs, who is the Dean Acheson Associate Professor of International Political Economy at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He is also a Senior Fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations and served as Chair of the European Union Studies Association from 2019 to 2021. Matthijs earned his undergraduate degree at the University of Antwerp in Belgium and his MA and PhD at Johns Hopkins University. He has written extensively for professional journals and journals of opinion such as Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. He is also the author of Ideas and Economic Crises in Britain, from Attlee to Blair, and has produced his most recent book with Mark Blyth, which I have here, called The Future of the Euro. So, please welcome to our stage Professor Matthijs.
Thank you, Professor Nelson, for that very, very generous introduction. I should mention that both Professors Hoge and Professor Marx were also chairs of the European Union Studies Association. So you have 6 years worth of chairs of the kind of the main academic organization in the United States that's committed to the study of the European Union and European integration. So anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here. I come from Washington, D.C., where the joke often goes it's Southern efficiency and Northern hospitality, which is not very nice to either the North or the South. But it is what it is. I also understand that the government shutdown is about to end this evening even. So hopefully I'll be able to fly back without any drama tomorrow. But anyway, I've greatly enjoyed my time here in Greenville. It's a real gem. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone about it, or everybody will move down here. So I want to talk about the Transatlantic Trump Trap, which is the title that I'm sure they will change of a foreign affairs piece with Attlee that's coming out in the next issue, the January-February 2026 issue, so you'll get a little preview. But I want to put it in a broader context, because I've been working on a sort of book-length manuscript on trying to make sense of the latest shift in European integration that's been ongoing, I guess starting really since 10 years ago, and that the book, the working title is From Rules to Tools. So how Europe, the European Union, is moving from a world of rules, and I guess a union that's very heavily rules focused, to developing much more sort of geoeconomic, macroeconomic tools in a way that makes it more sovereign. But I think that's still the question mark. So the subtitle is The Struggle for European Sovereignty, right? In a wink and a nod to William Hitchcock, who wrote a book, The Struggle for Europe, historian in early 2000s. So what do I want to do today? I want to talk about the question, the Monet line, whether Europe moves forward through crisis, and I want to make it more of an academic question and ask under what conditions does major change actually take place in European integration. And so what I'm proposing in this manuscript is a sort of macro structural theory of European integration, something I think that we've lost sight of, was not very fashionable in the 90s and the 2000s, because my sense is that most theories of European integration take the broad macro world as given, right? Whether it's the geopolitical situation, whether that's a bipolar world, a unipolar world, or a multipolar world, but also the macroeconomic paradigm that sort of reigns the universe, right? Whether it's a sort of neo-Keynesian view of going for full employment, or a more neoliberal view of focusing on inflation. We live in a very different world today, where what governments are after, for lack of a better term, is economic security or economic resilience or something like this. And it makes for a very different set of macroeconomic tools. So I'll briefly mention what Sophie Meunier and I have written on and called the EU's geo-economic revolution. This is not your father or mother's European Union you see today. It's a very different union compared to 2010, when I really started to become interested in European integration. And then the second half of my talk, I'll really focus on, so what has the return of Donald Trump meant for this new Europe, this geo-economic revolution? And I'll go through what I call, what Attlee and I in this piece call the Transatlantic Trump Trap in defense and security and in trade and investment, but also in democracy and rule of law. And then we can hopefully during the Q&A as well and during the panel discuss the way forward. So this is, if you're in the world I'm in, and the world Lisbeth and Gary are in, and Brent is in, and so many others here, Professor Good, this is probably the most used and abused line when anyone says anything on European integration and there's some sort of crisis, whether it's the refugee crisis or the Euro crisis or the pandemic. There's always somebody, usually an older man, who stands up and says, well, as Jean Monnet said in his memoirs, Europe will be forced in crises and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises. So what I find annoying about this line is that, of course, there's some truth to this, right? I mean, like, big changes don't happen unless there's a reason to. I mean, nobody just comes home one day and says, let's change everything about the house unless there's real problems, right? But it's massively overdetermined, right? There's so many crises where nothing happens. There's so many crises where actually tactical steps back are taken, right? And temporary sort of going back on European integration. So I'm not necessarily interested in small technocratic fixes that I think we've seen in many crises, where then, you know, the bleeding stops and most of the crisis goes away. I mean, I think the expert in this recently was Angela Merkel, right? Always doing just enough at the very end just to make things, stop things from falling apart. So as any good professor will tell you, a good research question starts with 3 words. Under what conditions, right? Under what conditions does a crisis actually lead to major change? And so here, the way I look, and so the advantage, I guess, of having tenure at an academic place is that you can think bigger and you can write bigger books for broader audiences. And I think that's something that at the Council on Foreign Relations, they very much encourage us to, is like to educate a broader public, even though it's probably still specialized. So the way I tend to look at European integration, that we're in the sort of 3rd big phase of it, and the big changes that happen in European integration tend to coincide or come after major crises. So the 3 major ones, I think, the Depression of the 30s and World War II, that's clearly European integration was a response to it, right? Never again war, coal and steel, the Treaty of Rome, all those institutions that were set up in the 1950s were clearly an attempt to have France and Germany never go to war again. But they coincided with the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, right? And so that, I think, is a very important background, structural background to European integration, because it was allowed to happen under sort of America's security blanket. And it also coincided with what you could call embedded liberalism, or the post-war settlement, where the consensus was, you know, never again high unemployment, never again bread lines and hunger marches and the things that we saw in the Depression. And it was also understood that this was going to be a liberalizing world, but where countries could step back from globalization, from liberalization, if there were, you know, local or national problems that had to be dealt with, things like safeguards and so on. So, of course, this system of European integration ran into trouble in the 1970s and early 1980s with the crisis of the 70s, the great inflation, the oil shocks, stagflation, and so on. And also this saw the end of this bipolar world of the Cold War and the slow emergence of the unipolar moment. And so that's where Europe adopted as well, and the European institutions wrote into treaties this sort of neoliberal settlement. And again, a lot has been written on this. I don't want to litigate this, but so the return of the market, the neoliberal settlement, and so this really starts in the mid '80s in Europe's response with the Single European Act, and then of course the Maastricht Treaty, European Economic and Monetary Union, and enlargement in the '90s. But so what I want to focus on is this last one, right? Since 2008, 2009, the Great Recession, we've really had a sort of long decade of crisis, right? And out of this is the kind of decade of crisis that questioned the neoliberal settlement and the settlement under the unipolar American order, because the world became much more competitive from a kind of multipolar world in geoeconomic and geopolitical competition. But also that the neoliberal settlement started to fall apart, right? It really started to fall apart in 2008-9. We saved the system. Dan Dresner at Tufts wrote a book in 2012 saying the system worked, and the system did work. It saved us from falling off a cliff. But the elements that we still talk about today and that we talked about yesterday, populism, right-wing resentment, cultural factors, all started to play into this. And so the rise of populism and protectionism is now, and that's, I think, still a question mark because we're in the middle of this transition, is leading towards with a question mark, is this leading towards more EU sovereignty, right? Is the European Union today better able to act and defend its interests in the world than it was 15 years ago? And so we've seen elements of this with Next Generation EU, the EU's pandemic response, which was a sort of fiscal bazooka. And then I think, a geoeconomic turn that started in earnest under Juncker with investment screening and things of that nature, but really took off with the first von der Leyen Commission, 2019, 2024, and I'll talk about that. So back to the theory, right? So under what conditions do we see major change in European integration? And here there's two things I want to bring back and put them front and center in theorizing about Europe and European integration. One is shifting geopolitics, right? So think about Europe, right? The way we still think about it today. What do you think about? Welfare states, which is a major part of European integration. But why was that possible to build, and why is it more advanced in Europe than it is in the United States? Because for most of the post-war period, the United States provided security through NATO, right? So NATO is a key element. And there was also strong US support for integration during the Cold War. Plus, the threat of the Soviet Union meant that the United States couldn't afford losing Europe, right? Remember, or don't remember, you're all too young to remember, even I am, but they tell me that apparently communist parties were very strong in France, in Italy, right? And so there was a real risk that Europe would fall to communism, all of it, and to Soviet influence. And so there was strong support from Kennedy, from Eisenhower, from post-war American presidents. This started to shift with Bill Clinton, Bush, Obama. So you have all three next to each other. So the period from like 92 through 2016, 3 US presidents, right, 6 terms, where there was growing ambivalence. I mean, even Barack Obama already, made this comment about that he didn't like free riders, right, that they annoyed him. And that the pivot to Asia was that actually the US was less directly focused and worried about European integration, also saw Europe in much more competitive terms. And that was clear already in the 90s during the Uruguay round, where the EU and the US were kind of fighting it out. But then in the last period, you've actually seen outright hostility from an American president. In this case, of course, the current president, Donald Trump, who, has said things like the EU was founded to screw over the United States, or who sees NATO as obsolete, right, and doesn't think America should be involved in Europe, and so on. So under those conditions, it's a lot harder for European integration and for European officials, as well as EU leaders, to push forward, because that sort of security blanket is much more tentative and questionable. The second, and this is inspired by Alan Milward's book, The European Rescue of the Nation State. So I think from a macroeconomic regime point of view, so think about this, political scientists love 2x2s, by the way, so I apologize. But so think about the two rows as the policy levels, right? So supranational on top and national on the bottom. And then think about the columns as levels of, this is kind of a Polanyian term, levels of socioeconomic embeddedness. So how much are institutions intermeshed with political and economic settlements, and how close, how much redistribution is there, how much sort of corrective mechanisms, institutional mechanisms are there for market capitalism. And so think about the movement from one via neoliberalism. So the macro regime one, the post-war consensus, what Millward talked about, the European rescue of the nation state, was still very much a national level economic consensus that focused on full employment and so on. And then in the 70s, 80s, right, we saw the movement towards neoliberalism, macro regime two, as I call it here. And of course, what Europe did was to take macro regime two and elevate it to the supranational level, right? So in Maastricht, in the Single European Act, a lot of these market rules were written into international treaties that were very hard to change, right? And so we're still sort of stuck in that framework. But think about European Union rules and constraint being much stronger. So I call this maybe somewhat not very generously Europe's cage, right? So European sort of a constraining of what nation states could do because they're surrendering more economic policy levers. Most obviously, of course, with trade policy that had already happened, but also with monetary policy, which then followed with rules and constraints on fiscal policy and limits on industrial policy and so on. So it's very little that national governments could do to correct for markets because most of it was elevated to the EU level, but very much in a disembedded way, right? So the EU as a center is not like the US government that can iron out business cycles. It's just a very small budget. They can do things on the margins, but by no means this is a macroeconomic player. So the question is, are we moving now, since in the last 15 years, towards a more embedding Europe, a Europe that is more capable of fighting back when it comes to economic crises, recessions, and so on. And I think we saw the birth of this really in the last sort of 10 years. We saw it fiscally in the pandemic response, but we've seen it in geo-economic terms with a sort of whole toolbox that was developed. So, and I'll talk about them in a minute. So we do see a more sovereign EU since 2015 emerging, but you have to see this together with the sort of change in geopolitical climate. So think about it this way, and then, again, no need to focus on too many details here, but so we've moved from embedded liberalism to neoliberalism. So embedded liberalism, that roughly, let's put it at 25 years, from 1945 to 1980. Another 25 years, so most of my childhood and I guess early career was dominated by neoliberalism, and then really by 2015 this started to fall apart, this consensus, right? And I think the first election of Donald Trump, the vote of Brexit, all these sorts of things, we were very much in a, call it neo-mercantilism, for lack of better term. And so the geopolitical reality, very different, right? So from the Cold War to a unipolar world, to a sort of return of history, multipolar world. So think in the first system, discretion of governments was more important than rules, right? So they stayed within a broad sort of rules-based system, international order, but most of the time governments had the last word. This shifted where rules became more important than government discretion. And now we're back where actually pretty much governments do whatever they want, right? As we've seen in this country. In the last year. So we've gone from a policy target being full employment in response to the Great Depression to a policy target in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s of low inflation or price stability in response to the crisis of the 1970s. That saw very high inflation. And now we see the emphasis everywhere, since the pandemic especially, on economic resilience, on minimizing vulnerabilities. But what this leads to, and that ties back to yesterday's discussion, these are different policy outcomes, right? So if you focus on inflation versus disinflation, back to positive inflation, labor share of GDP first goes up, capital share goes down, then that reverses in the second macro regime. It has consequences for income inequality. It has consequences for central banks, for legislatures, and for fiscal policy discretion. The point is, with these three different policy outcomes, is they create different winners and losers, right? And in the end, what is politics about is trying to organize voters into certain coalitions. And usually, if a certain part of the population loses for a long time from a given settlement, they start to organize and they become electorally more powerful. So now let's look at the long 20 teens, right? So the long decade, meaning it really starts in 2008, 2009, and it goes through, let's put it at 2022, right? The invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so we've had, and again, I feel like the last 15 years, I have given talks on every individual one of these crises, right? Because that was always what was in the news and what people wanted to understand. The Eurozone debt crisis, which, only really came to a halt in 2015. I think the most acute phase ended in 2013 after Mario Draghi's famous "we'll do whatever it takes" speech. But the Russian crisis in Ukraine started really in 2014, right? And this is still ongoing. It didn't start in 2022. We've had a refugee and migration crisis. We had a rule of law crisis, which is ongoing in Hungary, and Poland is recovering from it. We, of course, had a membership crisis when the UK voted to leave the European Union. And then we've had the challenge transatlantically from Donald Trump. So how has the European Union responded to this? And so I would say at first, it was a lot of technocratic fixes. It was later that this became much more hands-on. So think about this theory as such, right? So you have the international system, geopolitical change is happening. Europe is not an actor here, right? It's an event taker, if you want. It's major powers that drive this. The USSR and the US, then the US. Now you could say the US, Russia, and China. Geopolitical change drives the international economy, and so there you see macroeconomic regime change from embedded liberalism to ordo and neoliberalism in the EU to neo-mercantilism in the last 10 years. But then it's not because there's a crisis and these changes that things automatically are put into place, right? So it's our job as political scientists, economists, and so on to say, okay, well, how do you explain why Europe, there's many ways to skin a cat, right? Why does it take on this form? And so here, there's always, I think, in the big changes in European integration, there was an elite consensus about a sort of positive project going forward. But for elites to agree, and I focus on the big four of Europe, Germany, France, Italy, and the UK, the four G7 members, if you want, of Europe, it depends on things like what's their growth model, right? Germany relies on exports. The UK relies more on debt. Italy has a bigger government. So does France. It's a more mixed model. There's also national traditions and ideas. I mean, the French have always had a certain view of Europe. So have the Germans. So has the UK always been as an awkward partner. It wasn't even part of the story in the beginning, and it's not part of it anymore today. And so the national politics and how it comes in really is a game of power and elite bargaining, but heavily based on how they think about European integration. And so the way I make sense of this change is by looking, by sort of borrowing the terms from Albert Hirschman, as one of the greatest social scientists of his generation, and this idea of exit, voice, and loyalty. If you're unhappy with the way things are going in an organization, you have three responses. You can leave it, you can protest and voice your concerns to the leadership or trying to change it from within, or you can say, you know what, my country right or wrong, my EU right or wrong, right? I'm loyal to the way things are going. And so the four chapters that focus on these national responses since 2010, I mean, I don't have to tell you which is the exit case. I think everybody knows, right? That's the United Kingdom. They chose to leave the organization altogether, and so they've gone from having being in the EU with lots of opt-outs. They're now out of the EU and want more opt-ins, sort of thing. So it's a shift. The French have always wanted more voice for the EU level, even though, of course, there's a Gaullist tradition where they're also skeptical of this. But so l'Europe qui protège, so the idea that you can do for Europe how you see France. And then the Italians, I mean, and that's true for across the board for politicians, left, right, or center, they think that Italy, especially since the 1990s, is trapped in this sort of straitjacket, and they want to get out of it, right? They want more flexibility. And then Germany isn't here because they're the loyalty, right? They're actually loyal to the status quo. They think so far, even though it's starting to change, and I'll talk about it in a minute, this is starting to shift. So think about German loyalty to the status quo, but that's gradually changing. I think especially since Scholz, but more so with Friedrich Merz, who's been chancellor since the spring. So I think Merkel 1 and 2 were already very different from 3 and 4. We saw under Scholz, the previous chancellor, in a coalition, the traffic light coalition with the Greens and the Social Democrats, what he called a Zeitenwende, right? The watershed moment in a kind of, quite of an amazing speech in the Bundestag on Sunday, February 27th, 2022, in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then with Merz, I think, astonishingly so, on the election night in the spring of this year, he called for more independent Europe of the United States, because you could no longer rely on America's protection. France has been very consistent about more voice for the EU level, right? So they have one word for it: souveraineté, EU solidarity, and flexibility. This Macron is building on somewhat unsuccessful efforts by predecessors Sarkozy and Hollande. Italy wants more voice for the national level. So even Draghi talked about the need for fiscal flexibility and investment, but also solidarity, right? The Italian growth model being uniquely incompatible with existing Eurozone rules that have been very hard to reform. But you go from Berlusconi to Renzi to Salvini to Meloni, all agree on the need that Italy needs more breathing space within the European Union, needs more levers at the national level to respond to its unique problems. And then, again, I don't want to relitigate Brexit. It's taken 10 years of my life, I feel. It's actually the first piece I wrote for Foreign Affairs in September 2013. It was called David Cameron's Dangerous Game, and how he was setting the UK unwittingly on a kind of path that would see them leave the European Union. I put that in my 10-year file as like, look, I predicted this, or something like that, as close as you can get. You get lucky occasionally. And the Boris Johnson deal was a hard Brexit, right? The EU at arm's length, a break with the past. And I fear that, and I mean, I know that under Keir Starmer's Labour, this is now the sort of, it's settled, right? There will be no return to the single market or to the customs union, even though the UK is interested from a defense point of view in cooperating much more with either the EU or at least individual European countries. So we have this new emerging paradigm, right? Call it EU sovereignty. I prefer it over the sort of clunky term that the Commission prefers, called open strategic autonomy, right? Trying to please multiple audiences. But so we saw, I think the response started in May 2020, where you had a kind of extraordinary joint Franco-German declaration by Merkel and Macron. So here, Merkel in Berlin, Macron in Paris, socially distanced during the pandemic. I'm sure you all fondly remember it. And so I think most of the attention went to the recovery fund of 500 billion euro that was going to be financed by joint Eurobonds, by EU bond issues. But actually, what was more important is some of the others. The word sovereignty have started to appear everywhere. Health sovereignty, digital and green transition, right? And even the fourth point, which I think is a real break with sort of the Europe that I grew up with, is enhancing EU economic and industrial resilience by giving new impulse to the single market and an industrial policy at the EU level. So this results in Next Generation EU. Some people call this the Europe's Hamiltonian moment. I actually think it's more of a goalless moment, not a goalless Europe moment, but a goalless industrial policy moment, right? Where Europe is starting to catch up to the need to compete with the US and China, the kind of game that very few countries can play because they don't have the scale. Individual European countries can't play this on their own, they're too small, but the EU could play a sort of coordinating role. But then in response to the geopolitical pressures from China, Xi Jinping 2.0, starting in 2017, is very different, much more assertive, much more aggressive in industrial policy. And of course, Trump is a very different story from Obama 2.0. And so I remember when von der Leyen became Commission president, and she said that in following Juncker, who called himself the political commission, she said we're going to be a geopolitical commission. And there was a lot of snickering and sort of gentle laughter in New Delhi and Beijing and in DC and even in London, of course. But actually, looking back now, I don't think she quite realized it at the time when she said it. But the European Commission and the European Union have seen quite a big turn, right? So the geo-economic turn, what you could call the end of naivety by the European Union, saw the development of a set of geo-economic tools that you could say is nothing short of revolutionary from what we know the European Union to be in the 90s and the 2000s, right? So they developed an investment screening network modeled after CFIUS in the United States that would actually carefully look at investments coming in and if there were national security implications. There was an international procurement agreement, an instrument to deal with unfair competition. There was a foreign subsidies regulation that the EU passed. And of course, I think the one that got the most attention was the anti-coercion instrument, often referred to as the EU's big bazooka, that would allow the EU to retaliate against countries taking coercive economic action against the member states' legitimate sovereign choices for political reasons. It was actually originally developed in response to Trump 1.0. But then because Biden became president, they never had to use it. And then what it was really geared towards was in response to China, when there was pressure of the Chinese on Lithuania not to have a Taiwan embassy opening in the capital and things like in Vilnius and things like that. So this enables countermeasures. And this is much beyond just tariffs, right? Tariffs and quotas, exclusion from public procurement, blocking exports, restricted access to EU capital, things like services. And then they're still working on outbound screening, on the nature of economic security. So there's been this sort of wealth of activity on the European Union that makes it much more of a player. And we've seen this because actually, and again, I've lived in DC on and off, but most of my life, the last 23 years, apart from Juncker, who visited the White House once as Commission president, I don't remember any Commission president, people even knowing who they were in DC. And now there's this sort of old line, it's a boring old line by Henry Kissinger, who do I call when I call Europe, right? And there's no good answer. And I think for the last 15 years, the answer usually was call Angela Merkel, right? She's the most powerful chancellor of the most powerful country. She's the one that will make the big decisions or push in a certain direction. But I think in the last 5 years, it's been Ursula von der Leyen. That's the number you call. Right? And it was very clear during the Biden administration, but it's clear now during this Trump administration, right? Whether it's sanctions, whether it's trade, and even whether it's certain questions of security, of aid to Ukraine, and so on. The EU plays a much bigger role. So is this the new EU paradigm? I mean, again, and here is a question of sort of, is the glass half full, is it half empty? Usually when people ask me, is Europe going to become like a major player in the next 5 years? My answer is like, well, it could, but is it going to? Probably not, right? I mean, because there are too many divisions. We can talk about this during the Q&A. So there's the genius, I think, of EU sovereignty or strategic autonomy is that it can appeal to multiple audiences for multiple things, right? In a way that our colleague Nicolas Japko wrote a book in 2006, Playing the Market, that the Commission successfully used the market as a sort of catch-all phrase in the late 80s, early 90s to push through a very new EU. So there is a consensus emerging that the EU needs to be able to act more autonomously to defend its interests in a multipolar world. This has given much more power to the European Commission. Right? Remember, and I'm sure Gary and Lisbeth fondly remember those debates of who was the big winner of the euro crisis, and it was seen to be Germany or an intergovernmental Europe and so on. But if you look now, actually, the Commission over time, and for different reasons, has gained quite a bit of power. And so that said, there are still a lot of debates on how do you get there? How do you get Europe to be a much bigger player internationally? And I think the one thing often forgotten is what Lisbeth said at Tocqueville Tacos today is that there's not an innate desire amongst every European to become a superpower either, right? So it's not like China and the United States in that sense that feel a kind of responsibility to lead or play a big role. There's north-south differences on there. There's east-west differences. There are small versus large member states who think differently about it. And then there's a question, does EU sovereignty mean less national sovereignty? And that then plays into the far right and so on. So a year ago, I would have ended my talk here. And we would have said, okay, let's talk about, where Europe is going. But there's been a sort of major challenge to this emerging Europe, right? And so Donald Trump's return to the White House in 2025 was a much more direct challenge, I think, to European unity. And so my response, if Professor Nelson had invited me last year, would have been like, listen, this is a very different European Union. They have the tools. They have probably more unity. They have learned from the first Trump administration by building all these tools. They've been through the pandemic. They have more fiscal capacity. They've played this sort of much more unified role in supporting Ukraine. So I would have been very hard-pressed to predict how Europe would respond. And so that's now what I think, and this is joint work with Attlee, my new colleague at SAIS Bologna, who's the director of the Institute of International Affairs in Rome and Italy, is that actually since Trump's return in January 2025, Europe's reaction has been one of appeasement. Basically, to give Trump whatever he wants, or at least most of it. And so instead of building more autonomy or collective resistance, the EU has tended towards, most of the time, bending the knee. And this is true across three core areas, right? There's been accommodation or submission, whatever term you prefer. This is true in security, this is true in trade, it's true in values. And I'll tell you why, and it ties into the theme of yesterday. And then I'll also say how short-term stability is one thing, but it leads to longer-term dependence, right? So defense and security. There was at the Hague summit where Europe actually, without Trump even asking, came up with this 5% term. This was not something Trump asked during the elections. He was still talking about 2, 3, 2.5, 3%. He was jokingly throwing out 5%, thinking 5, 2, we'll settle at 3.5, something, right? So the European allies of NATO really wanted to give Trump a win, and nobody embodied this better than Mark Rutte, pictured there, right, the former Dutch prime minister, who said, okay, Europe will buy more American weapons, and here you see this US profiting from the Ukraine war and Europe paying very different approach from the Biden years. And so, but this also has meant that the dependence on US defense supply chains have only deepened. And so, I mean, here you see this text message that Mark Rutte sent to Trump on his way over from DC to The Hague. Mr. President, dear Donald, congratulations and thank you to your decisive action in Iran. That was truly extraordinary and something no one could have done or could have done. And so you are flying into another big success, The Hague this evening. Donald, you have done as a truly really important moment to America and Europe. And then at some interview, he called him NATO's daddy. I mean, it was cringe-worthy. I mean, every European watched this and was just deeply uncomfortable. And of course, this famous line that Europe became too dependent on Russia for its energy, on America for its security, and on China for its growth, and it's becoming even more dependent on the United States in the short term, at least. When it comes to trade and investment, there's this sort of very interesting moment, right? If you think about the 5 stages of grief, where a lot of Europe was still stuck in denial, I think the Commission had already raced towards acceptance of new tariffs happening. That said, the Commission was very clear that they were going to get a better deal than the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom signed a deal very quickly at 10% tariffs, and then the European Union was like, okay, maybe on military stuff, we're not a giant. We know that. But on trade, on economics, we're a superpower, right? I mean, that's without doubt. And so the idea that they would eventually accept this sort of asymmetric deal in Scotland, in Tilbury, and we can talk about how that summit went. But US tariffs were capped at 15%, far above the pre-Trump tariff levels. And I think what's most striking is what Europe decided not to do. Right? From the very beginning, they decided not to retaliate. They decided to negotiate. There was enormous pressure, especially from Italy, from Germany, to basically give Trump what he wants. France and Spain were more willing to use the anti-coercion instrument. But you could rewrite this history saying Europe could have reacted very differently, right? And it might have had very different consequences. But so you have this rules-based rate replaced by Trump transactionalism. And this, I think, especially for many countries around the world, the moment the EU caved to the US, they're like, okay, what are we supposed to do now? You guys are supposed to hold up the rules of the international trading system. If you're not doing this, then we're all lost. And then finally, on democracy and the rule of law, I mean, the European Union is a value-based community, right? I mean, you don't get to enter the EU unless you fulfill certain criteria on democracy, the rule of law. And so there's been mostly silence in the face of backsliding. So Trump attacks the press, the judiciary, democratic norms, but Europe stays mostly silent to preserve this sort of very fragile détente on the security front and on the trade front. And then silence then normalizes this sort of US illiberalism and also shrinks any moral authority Europe had left on this front. So now you're asking me, okay, why? I mean, European leaders aren't stupid, right? I mean, they're clearly they weigh and they think about the possible responses and they weigh the different costs and benefits. And so clearly there was the fear of something much worse, right, than what they accepted. Right? NATO could have collapsed. There could have been an all-out trade war where the US raises tariffs, the EU responds, that then leads to inflation in Europe, which means the central bank has to raise interest rates, you go into recession, right? And so that's way worse. They could have been an all-out Trump-Putin détente, right? And so the idea was, well, better a bad deal than absolutely no deal. And it's also seen that placation of Trump was seen as quite clever, right? It's what he needs. It's what he wants. It's not a strategy. It's mostly just damage control. Right? For the EU negotiating with the UK after Brexit, it was about damage control, not about optimizing anything, just about limiting the damage that it would do. But of course, appeasement is very different from autonomy, right? It entrenches hierarchy. And so you see here this picture in Scotland that was taken, and the one person that can't bring herself to smile is Sabine Weyand on the left of von der Leyen, the German director of DG Trade. The others kind of have a bit of a smile, but clearly do not believe in it. So why appeasement, right? Well, it has domestic roots. And here we come back. We kind of bring the circle whole with yesterday's conversation. Is the rise of far-right populism, or the rise of the tan parties, the parties that are more authoritarian, nationalistic, and so on, like, means a much more divided, a much more cautious European Union, right? After all, the far-right argues, I mean, look, the UK got a better deal, right? So what's the point of sticking together, right? Clearly, we could have done bilateral deals with Trump and might have gotten better terms. Right? And so it's made centrist elites look weak. And it's also made that the far right has gained in legitimacy, right? So nationalism clearly dampens integration, right? So we've seen the Draghi and the Letta reports stalled because these are very hard reports to implement. And also the new and the higher defense targets, they fuel a sort of guns versus butter backlash. And I think we're going to see more of this, where there's a question, okay, especially in countries that have not much fiscal space, how can we address this? And so the consequences for the European Union is you see weak integration, right? So I would love to see more joint borrowing, but in the short term, it's hard to see. There's minimal defense coordination. And there's a renationalization even of certain policies. And so the trap is that Europe is appeasing Trump because of the pressure of the far right. But as they're appeasing Trump, they make Trump look successful. He's winning. His policies are working. Why not do what Trump does at home in Europe? Make Europe great again, make France great again, make Germany great again, right? And so far-right parties, even though they have a complicated relationship with Trumpism, because clearly Trump is out to weaken Europe, but they want to imitate some of his policies, whether it's immigration, whether it's maybe even trade policy, protectionist policies, and so on. So dependence on the US shows weakness of centrist politicians. That then leads to populist gains. So for example, you ask, there's a major survey that asked the 5 biggest countries of the EU, including Spain, what they thought of the Turnberry trade deal. 72% said it was asymmetric and it was mostly the US gaining from it, and 53% said it was humiliating for Europe, right? So as Europe gets humiliated, populists gain. That then makes Europe even more cautious and worried. That leads to then even more dependence. And so the root cause is the far-right strength that makes Europe so cautious on the integration front, but it doesn't punish the far-right. They only get stronger. So, last point. What can Europe still do? And this is something we propose in Foreign Affairs, so this is kind of written for a sort of policy-oriented audience. So, I mean, the roadmap was written by Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta, but let's be honest, realistically, I would love them to implement all of it to the letter. It's not going to happen, right? But selectively, I think they can do certain things. There's probably more promise in the defense coalition of the willing, rather than doing this through the EU with too many veto players. So France and the UK were the leaders of this. Germany, Poland, Baltics, and the Nordics could probably coordinate much more and move much faster, because the EU itself is constrained, because of course the UK is not a member. Trade diversification beyond the United States. So this is underway. Mercosur, Indonesia, other trade deals, like-minded countries like Canada, Korea, Japan, right? Where you basically become less reliant on the United States. A more autonomous China policy, right? So big, firm, but pragmatic, right? No need to follow the US, because as we know, Trump goes there and then signs deals just between the US and China, and you're left out in the cold. And then I think that the main thing where Europe can make a difference is energy sovereignty, right? But they need to double down on the Green Deal rather than run away from it and buy more American LNG gas. So strategic autonomy is not necessarily anti-Americanism. It just means you choose Europe. You don't have to choose between China and the United States, but you just choose yourself. Europe must learn to say no when interests diverge. So I expect more pressure to come in the months to come on the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, on the Green New Deal, on supply chain regulation, and watering down that stuff because American companies want it. Europe then needs to clearly say no. And so think realism rather than rhetoric. So focus on achievable sovereignty. And then, final point is that, the appeasement may well have been rational, but ultimately, I think it'll prove self-defeating because it's only making the far right stronger. All right. I hope I've stayed within my time, Brent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite the remaining panelists, Lisbeth, Gary, Marion, to come to... Oh, lost it. Thank you. And I'll introduce each one of them as well. So I'm going to leave you to read the bios, as I said before. But let me say that Lisbeth Huga is the W.R. Keenan Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a research professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, the European University Institute at Florence. And if you saw one of those pictures, you saw Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman. And that's the center they're at. So, it's named after a famous founder of the EU. She earned her undergraduate and graduate degree at KU Leuven in Belgium and taught at the University of Toronto before moving to Chapel Hill in 2000. Since joining the UNC faculty, Professor Huga has been a principal investigator of the Chapel Hill Expert Survey on Political Parties. And Gary Marks is the Burton Craig Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and also a research professor at the Robert Schumann Center. He earned his bachelor's degree at Birmingham University, an MA from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a PhD at Stanford. In 2010, he was awarded a Humboldt Research Prize for his contributions to political science. Professor Marks co-founded the UNC Center for European Studies and the EU Center of Excellence, serving as director until 2006. And then finally, my colleague, Marion Strobel, is the William Montgomery Burnett Professor Emeritus of History at Furman. She earned a BA at Mount Holyoke and an MA and PhD at Duke University. Professor Strobel studies the history of American politics after World War II. So I will do what we did last night and have now the three panelists give a response to what Matthias has given to us this evening, and we'll see where the discussion goes after that. So why don't I start all the way down with Lisbeth at the end, unless you are, don't want to start, can knock it over to Gary.
It gives me the chance to say what a brilliant presentation this was.
Yeah.
And big sweep, a really big sweep and overview. And, my problem is there's not a lot that I disagree with. Like you, I didn't know what to expect with the Trump trap. But like you, I was actually surprised and certainly disappointed about the appeasement on the three levels that you pointed out. I'm trying to kind of add something different to what you said of what might be going on. I think and curious what you think of it. You were really emphasizing, you could almost say the argument that national governments were kind of, or elites more generally in Europe, were too afraid of their own public opinion to confront or to use the ambition of strategic autonomy to actually confront the Trump administration, which, is something I think I cannot deny. I mean, given that we've argued that in our work as well. But I think there's something else going on. There probably is still a bit of denial of what is happening in this country. Despite the fact that this is the second time that Trump is in power. And that is, you mentioned the Washington Consensus 2.0, and I wrote down, isn't it a Washington dissensus? Right? I mean, it's from a European perspective, and it's probably more hope than reality, not settled, quite settled yet, that what was a transatlantic relationship that was rarely always smooth. There have been, frictions in the past on a bunch of issues when you look at the history of transatlantic relations. But it was more one of, you put it very well, since the Clinton era, a time more of ambivalence relationship, but also at the same time, regular discomfort, but at the same time, a kind of a fundamental trust that in the end, when it comes down to it, we're on the same side, right? But Trump and MAGA, it really is outright hostility, particularly with respect to the EU. But I think there's still that hope that sort of Washington dissensus, that other side can come back. So there's a reliance on a domestic reversal in the US. And why should we Europeans, never known to be very bold and brave, just take the hit on this? Let's sit it out. I think I'm concerned that probably is relying too much on a domestic reversal here. But I think that was playing still and still is very strong in the elites, among elites in Europe, and it allows them to sort of give in to a certain vocal section of public opinion, a minority in virtually all countries that doesn't want to be punished economically or otherwise by confrontation with this United States.
Gary, do you want to take the mic and add your own comments?
Yes, I really enjoyed the talk. And it's so interesting the way we understand Europe, that has changed so much over time. The European Union began in geopolitics. That is to say, following World War II, there were the geopolitics, if you like, of France and Germany trying to avoid continued war, to provide some overarching institutional frame in which they could exist in peace with each other in some much more kind of creating a world of overflowing national borders. Economic growth was absolutely key. But the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact was absolutely crucial. So the European Union started in geopolitics. But then, given the American frame of protecting Europe and providing the resources for that and the security of that, NATO was the security element, then we started to say, well, the European Union exists in this kind of isolation from geopolitics, that it was creating a rule-based order in which you could think of the good things in life without worrying about conflict among countries. And to be honest, that's the way, when you read studies of European integration, actually including some of the things that Lisbeth and I have written, it's about what goes on within Europe. And the dynamics of European integration were self-generated. That is to say, you had to understand the conflicts within Europe, the possibilities within Europe, the politics within Europe. And what I think so interesting about your talk is that you can't do that now. And for people who are trying to understand Europe in a fundamental sense, it's a real challenge. So how, what is the effect of geopolitics on the potential for European integration? And then you can say, well, what is the effect of European integration on world politics? These are two really interesting questions. And I don't think we really know the answers. Because on the one side, you can say, well, Trump is actually strengthening tan parties, the radical right parties. That what's happening is that there's greater dissension in Europe by virtue of what Trump has, managed to do in terms of, the humiliation, if you want to put it that way. And I think it's, there's a real point there of Europe, or the bending of the knee. I think it's, really interesting. And I think the bottom line is kind of the emphasis in your first part of your talk. That is these functional pressures on Europe to get its act together. Look, imagine that you're 27 kind of medium-sized or small actors, and you see two kind of giant gorillas, or three giant gorillas come along. What is the incentive there? The incentive is to get your act together. And I think if I had to kind of get a bottom line, I think that would be it. And I would add one little more piece of spice to that. And that would be China. Now, the United States and China are at a greater level of adversity, of animosity even, than was certainly the case 5 years ago. It's increasing. Where does Europe stand in that? Think about the United States in the late 1930s, up until actually 1941, with respect to Germany and Britain. The United States, there was great division within the United States about actually what to do. There were tremendous forces of isolation. And if you look at this from a British perspective, the United States actually, Churchill and Roosevelt had tremendous conflicts about this. The United States gained just about all of the UK's foreign resources, all of its gold. It had enormous bargaining power because it wasn't directly involved in the conflict. Just imagine a world in which the European Union turn around to the United States and to China to say, look, we'll have to decide here. We'll have to decide exactly what we're going to do. For example, in the context of Taiwan, will we support the United States if the United States actually turns around and says, look, this is unacceptable behavior, also because of Taiwan's potential for AI and other technological progress. So the European Union has immense bargaining power that it has not used vis-a-vis the United States and China. And the truth of the matter is that the European Union and China together have a greater GDP than the United States of America. So, this is the danger of Trump's game. The danger of Trump's game is that he creates in Europe a capacity for strategy, for rational, hard-level geopolitical strategy. And actually, there are some people in Europe who are starting to think that they should play this kind of rational power balancing game that Trump is kind of leading the way in. Now, I'm a person who has one foot in the United States and one foot in Europe. And that is, I'm a transatlantic person. So I would, really fear the kind of attitude that Trump has were it to be translated into European policy.
Marion, I think maybe you can take Matthias's microphone.
I think I might.
Are you? Oh, you're
My
coming up
props.
here. Yes.
I have props.
Yeah, she's fine. I'm fine with that.
Okay.
She's my senior colleague.
Okay. All right. I did not know what was going to be said tonight until I actually got here. So, and I am not a political theorist under any stretch of the imagination. My remarks were in large part, historians love to contextualize things. We have to what are the analogies here? And so what kind of struck me was the July-August issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, Who Needs Allies? So my remarks are more or less dependent on that, or that's my thought process on these. And so I began to go back and think, well, what about American alliances? We've talked here about U.S., EU, and the age of Trump, but I'm thinking, George Washington came up with the idea of let's stay clear of entangling alliances. We really didn't get into any alliances until World War I, when we had to help out to make the world safe for democracy, as we put it. Wilson came out with his 14 points during toward the ends of the war. He had a variety of things that he wanted to accomplish, including the League of Nations. We steered clear of the League of Nations. We did not join. As we've had it said, we became isolationist, and this continued. Again, nothing to entangle us. But we continued, as we've also heard, to be very much a part of the economic situation of the world. And in the 1920s, as I was doing some research, I discovered that we actually put up some pretty high tariff barriers, which sounds a lot like 2025. Also in 1930, you had the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which was extremely high tariff barriers. And what this led to was that made Europeans harder to make debt repayment. And then they put up retaliatory tariffs, and the whole situation more or less fell apart. And then we had a debt moratorium for a while, and then we gave that up. And then Congress passed an act called the Johnson Debt Default Act, which meant that private citizens couldn't even loan monies to the various European nations who had defaulted on their loans. Now, granted, Donald Trump is very different from this, but that kind of antagonism that existed in the 20s and the 30s is very much, I think, I have this sense of that, and that's what I think is important. And he is often, as we know, even in first term, harped on scofflaw nations who did not pay their full NATO dues. And then, of course, he raises the tariffs in 2025. So we continued, of course, with our isolationism until World War II, when we became much involved. And then in the post-war world, after we did finally reluctantly get involved in war, due to Pearl Harbor and Hitler declaring war on us. We ended up issuing the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, Berlin Airlift that was our big thing, and of course NATO. And at that point, I think we became pretty Eurocentric. We even joined the United Nations as long as it could be headquartered in New York City, not in Europe. There were other treaties as well. And then there continued to be the Berlin crises of 58 and 61. We, on the other hand, did not get involved when the Russians invaded Hungary in 56 or Czechoslovakia in 68. We kind of understood whose barriers were whose. The 1990s, of course, changed things completely when the Soviet Union collapsed, and and so did its partner regimes. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and we had lots of things happening where Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia broke up into their ethnic groups and the like. And then, of course, in 2014, Putin invaded Crimea, and then in 2022, Ukraine. And there is a new article, either yesterday or today's Wall Street Journal, that a former student sent me, in which somebody says, hey, Putin's role model is really Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. Those are the people he's looking up to. So this has changed things a lot for us. Well, at any rate, we continued with NATO. And what is, I think, interesting is some of Trump's remarks about NATO. My other prop, John Bolton's The Room Where It Happened. This is the recently indicted John Bolton, who in part is in trouble because of what is in this book. And in the book, he writes about a Zoom meeting that was ostensibly about Afghanistan, but at the end of the meeting, they were all supposed to discuss Ukraine. Now, this was in 2019, right before Bolton left office. And he yells out, he's on Zoom to Trump, well, what about what about Ukraine? And what the response was here, let me get my pages straight. Oh, dear. Oh, yeah, here it is. Okay, Trump says, I don't give a, and he used a 4-letter word that begins with an S and ends with a T, okay, about NATO. I'm ready to say, if you don't pay, we won't defend them. I want the assistance money earmarked for Ukraine to be paid through NATO. He then said, Ukraine is a wall between us and Russia, meaning, according to Bolton, that Trump saw Ukraine as a barrier to closer Moscow-Washington relations. Bolton then goes on to write, as Trump continued to talk, he feared that he was going to announce that we were withdrawing from NATO. Now, I find this rather shocking, and again, things have changed in the last 6 years, but one wonders if Trump's attitude has really changed towards NATO, or indeed, according to Ukraine. I doubt it, actually. Our president does not seem overly eager to help Ukraine. He has proposed even some cession of territory to Russia that was Ukrainian. We have our tariff issues, the Turnberry deal, which we've had talked about tonight. And I think that is certainly something of great concern. And the issue, of course, is, did Europe cave to U.S. demands, particularly because of some of Eastern Europe being concerned about Ukraine and what might happen to them. There's also fears of Russian aggression in Poland and perhaps into the Arctic. And there's been some really interesting articles about Finland in that regards. So my sense is right now, Europe feels vulnerable to U.S. political cycles and also to Donald Trump's unpredictability. Europe may resent being the U.S.'s junior partner in light of its own desire for autonomy and trade diversification. Security concerns, of course, remain a high priority, But I'm wondering if Europe can continue to rely on the United States for a variety of things, including its energy needs and also defense. And what about climate change and the US rejection of the Paris Accords? So, my sense is Donald Trump's foreign policy in 2025 is driven by a kind of America First philosophy, which is different from Charles Lindbergh, who didn't want us to get involved in war in the 1930s, but also of what George Washington had in mind 225 years ago. It is also different from the idealism of Wilson or the realism of Roosevelt or the détente of Richard Nixon or the willingness of Ronald Reagan to cooperate with Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev. Trump seems fixated on unilateralism, making America great again, transactional business relationships, the art of the deal, a focus on homeland security, plus energy dominance of the traditional sort, not meaning wind power or anything of that sort. So lost in the shuffle, I think, is American allegiance to alliances, perhaps not far from what we discovered after World War I. So we must ask, are we seeing a cyclical pattern in U.S. policies, or is Donald Trump suggesting something new? My guess is the latter, especially in terms of his impulsiveness and lack of grace. The United States should not be hasty in its actions. We must give careful consideration to the significance of our moves before long-term relationships and friendships, including with Canada as well as Europe, become fractured beyond repair. Clearly, some of our allies are already feeling less willing to defer to U.S. interests as they themselves grow in autonomy. Is this what we want? And I'll just end by saying, we certainly live in interesting times, don't we? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to stop there and open it up to the audience because I know some of this has got to have gotten your juices flowing and some questions coming. And as always, we start with students. If there are any burning questions, Zach has one.
Yeah. Thank you for coming out to talk to us. Under what conditions, I'm going to steal your phrase, under what conditions would a defense coalition between the EU countries be possible? And if this is implemented, what would that look like?
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent question. So can you? So the question is, under what conditions would a European defense come together?
Yeah, like what would a European defense, if it were to come together, what would it look like? And then what conditions would be needed?
Yeah,
for that to even happen.
So I mean, I can imagine a direct invasion. I mean, you could see an amassing of Russian troops along the border of, let's say, Latvia or Estonia, the two hardest places to defend from a sort of traditional ground invasion, the way we saw troops building in late 21, early 22, and then famously, is it Napoleon's line? You can do many things with a bayonet, but not sit on it. Right. So at some point, you're going to use the weapons you've amassed at the border to invade. I can see NATO having a crisis session invoking Article 5, but Trump's interpretation of Article 5 being very different from what in Europe they think is that there'll be 50,000 Marines on the first flight over to defend and to basically push back Russia in the way the United States pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, right? Because again, that's a condition under which I can see the coalition of the willing, Britain, France, Germany, the Nordics, and the Baltics, immediately saying, okay, this is real. Who can do what? We're immediately responding. And the question is how this can play out. Of course, I don't think Putin is that crazy either, right? I think there's still that deterrent. You never know. What if Trump immediately responds? We are sending American troops. And so in many ways, I mean, I'm not a defense expert, right? But it does. I've lived around them for long enough to have someone supposed to, I listen to them, right? But in a way, the worst thing that could happen for European defense is actually a sort of fragile ceasefire in Ukraine tomorrow, because it will take the urgency out of a European defense buildup, right? So actually, the current status quo is not bad from that point of view. Under the conditions, Europe can become a defense player, because they are. I mean, I talked about appeasement, right? A lot of this is short-term appeasement, right? They are doing at the same time quietly a lot of the things that you'd want Europe to do to build more autonomy, right? I mean, these are just things that will take a very long time to do. It is not going to happen overnight.
Anybody else want to take that? Does that sound good?
I totally agree with that. And, you know, the way things may work out, I mean, think of how it worked out in the Sudetenland. This was the area in what was then Czechoslovakia, which had a German population, and the mobilization of that population in demonstrations, demands for autonomy from Czechoslovakia to build a bridge to Germany. Well, there are Russian populations in these Baltic countries. So even if you didn't get an overt invasion, you know, what Putin may play with is just mobilizing these populations, or trying to mobilize these populations in all sorts of ways that fall short of a hot war, but which would test NATO over and over again. And we can virtually expect that irrespective of the outcome in the Ukraine.
And we actually see that now, don't we? We were talking about at dinner last night. Hybrid warfare is already a part of Europe's everyday life. Their drones are flying over capital cities. Lines are being cut in oceans. You've got, Alex Stubb had to deal with forced migrants across the border. They were just the Russians were just pushing people into Finland to try to destabilize the country. And so, you don't have to be shooting to be in a war. And so I think that is something that should cause all of us to pause for a moment. So, yeah, okay, Lisbeth.
Just one sentence to. Okay, yeah, one sentence to add to that, and that is actually reported in the media
I'm
on
sorry,
a daily basis.
yeah,
That
yeah.
is reported in the media on a daily basis. I think that is important because the public opinion is learning that the threat is real.
Question.
I actually have a question. So
Okay, all right, Ellison.
I'm going to take advantage of holding the mic. You mentioned a concern for the United States of Europe and China moving together against the U.S. I've thought of a lot of different alliances that the U.S. should be concerned about, but this is not one that had ever crossed my mind. I guess I had always seen us as kind of a packaged unit as the West as a whole. Is that a genuine concern that a certain constituency holds, and how far does Trump have to go for that to really become an issue, especially with the rise of these tan parties coming into European politics?
Look, it's not on the agenda right now, but you've got a lot of isolation. It begins with isolationism. That was the case in the United States. When it became clear that the Nazi Party and Germany was a threat to stability and peace in Europe. But if you just think of if you study international relations, realism is a very prominent theory, and in realism you simply look at the power quotients, the power capabilities of states, and then you say, okay, where are they, and they're closely related to the economic power of countries. And so, from a realist perspective, the European Union has immense bargaining capacity. And what essentially Trump is doing, and this came out very clearly in both of what you've been talking about, he's been loosening and weakening that soft power, those relationships that take decades and sometimes longer to build, that came out of World War II and the great alliance in World War II, and that has been fraying. And moreover, Trump, his transactionalism, it's not only the United States that could become transactionalist. Now, the reality is that's not on the agenda now. But there's rising isolationism in Europe, and the outcome of that is, if Trump plays these realist game, and when you're thinking about transactionalism, where is transactionalism most effective? It's to your friends, not to your enemies. Your enemies expect transactionalism or even something more power related, but it's to your friends that you can actually start to squeeze them. And so Trump has actually been most effective in pulling the benefits not out of Russia. He hasn't done that out of Russia. He hasn't done it out of China. He's done it out of Europe and other democracies that rely, and Canada. I mean, think about the irony of that. And then you think, what could the further implications of that be?
I think also we should consider, if we go back to the 70s, where we had this policy of triangulation as far as China goes with the Soviet Union and Nixon, and this was a part of Kissinger's strategy, was to kind of put ourselves in between those two, and actually, worked out reasonably well in terms of various kinds of détente and things of that sort. But it sure made everybody, made those two powers nervous, because they weren't sure what was going to happen. Again, that did not affect Europe at that time, but it was still there. Although you did in 71, 72 of the quadripartite Berlin Agreement, which regularized the border crossings, and East and West Germany decided to recognize each other, and you had the Helsinki Accords and things of that sort. So there were some involvement, but the whole triangulation I thought was a fascinating strategy.
Jack, do you have a question?
So I guess one of the things that I've learned is one of the best ways to build, I guess, an identity is to contrast yourself to the people who you aren't, to the people who are attacking you or making you feel threatened. And so I just want, could you talk more about how that kind of interplays with Trump? Of there's a more nationalistic push even within the European Union. However, you have this outside power threatening a whatever European identity exists. Which one do you think is going to win out? The more nationalistic, fragmented Europe, or the supranational, European Union? I guess in contrast to America.
Yeah, let me try to answer this. I think both Gary and Lisbeth are equally, if not better, placed to answer this. I mean, there's a danger in thinking of a supranational Europe as a progressive, pro-green Europe, right? I mean, and in many ways that's where it had evolved. And there's clearly a backlash against this, both at the national level, but also at the EU level, right? You see more and more EU policies that we think of as important watered down, right? And it's usually by center-right to right-wing coalitions, either within the parliament or in, actually, probably more importantly, in the European Council, as well at the level of heads of state or government. And so, I mean, in the end, I at least like to think, I mean, whatever I want personally is less important than I think what the voters in Europe want. If the voters want a more conservative EU that goes in a slightly different direction, then I think that will be the way for the EU to go, right? The question is that Europe going to go the way that undermines, I mean, it should not compromise. I mean, we can discuss fiscal policy, monetary policy, industrial policy, I mean, all these things, immigration, all these things I think are fair debates of where the EU should go. And arguably it is going in a more conservative direction, which I think will make it more sustainable. But to make this a sort of the product of a cultural elite of professors sitting in capitals that are more comfortable flying to other capitals than going to the hinterland or the rural parts of countries, that I think is actually much more problematic. The question is, if there really is a sort of 10-party takeover of the European Union, what does that look like? Does that make the whole stronger? Or is it just basically picking away at whatever's been built, and does that lead to a fragmenting Europe? Because the problem here is that there was such a thing as a socialist international. They agreed on the same principles of class struggle and like capital versus labor and so on. But there is, as you see in the European Parliament from yesterday's talk, there is no nationalist international because fundamentally they disagree with one another. Right? I mean, there's three groups now that represent far right or tan parties, and one, less likable even than the other. But so that, I think that's what's hard to predict. But I'd be interested to see what Lisbeth or Gary think on this.
I think we're one last comment, and we're going to have to wrap it up here. So.
Oh, I thought we had until 6:45.
Yeah, we might be losing a few more people.
My first response to your question, it's a really interesting question, is yes, on both sides.
Yeah.
And that's the that's the challenge for understanding Europe. So on the one side, you've got these functionalist pressures, which we're describing in terms of, the Russian threat becoming more patent and more potent. On the other, you've got this, response domestically of tan parties. And so you might say, well, this kind of polarization or the potential for different paths has grown. And I really do think so. You can think of it as a tipping phenomenon. But just imagine a world in which tan parties were, they're very close to power, but they were even closer to power, and they really had power. And so let's say France and Germany, or even both of those. And there was and then imagine this Russian threat being, really clear, transparent. Well, what would they do? What would they do? It may be a little bit like Nixon going to China. If the tan parties take up a European perspective, you can't. There's a reality there, and the reality is that European countries individually can't do nothing. I mean, you saw the graphs that we gave yesterday. I mean, the spending is there. It's double that of Russia in terms of defense spending, and 40% more than China. And so, together they can really do something, individually not. So maybe, I can imagine a world in which tan parties, this is a real speculation, in which tan parties would really take up the cudgel of European integration, supranationalism.
Boy, wouldn't that be ironic? I'll just make one last comment myself. I don't know that Donald Trump himself thinks too strategically about these things, but some of the people around him do. So Steve Bannon, for instance, and I think this was mentioned sometime the last 2 days, about his desire to form a kind of MAGA, international MAGA movement, right? And here's the thing. Everything about the European Union is anathema to them. Everything. The cooperation, the wokeness, the climate control, but just the rule-based, anything that's rule-based that hems me in, doesn't allow me to make my own decisions. I think that there's a certain animosity and hostility towards the idea of a European Union that actually drives Donald Trump to make irrational choices about what would be best for America as we think about a geopolitical struggle. It would be better to have the United States and Europe in the same on the same team. But it could be that Donald Trump could drive Europe to Russia. That would be an alternative. The tan parties take power and then they align with Russia rather than against Russia. Whatever it is, I don't think the strategy of European isolationism is going to work. It would work if they lived in the same spot as Latin America. But they don't. They live right there where the great powers always struggle. And so Europe is going to have to make some choices, it seems to me. And, we've got a bunch of options on the table. And at dinner, we're going to straighten it all out. So, with that, this is the last for this term. Tocqueville reconvenes in January to talk about the American Constitution with Yuval Levin and Philip Munoz, and we're going to gear it all back up again. But until then, happy holidays. You're dismissed. Let's give a hand to our guests.